Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our first AL.com Legislative Town Hall. I am going to be your host and moderator today. My name is Ivana Harinkyu, and this is an event that is made possible by our AL.com subscribers. If you would like to be part of those who support journalism, please go online to www.al.com/subscribe. We will leave that information in the comment thread so you can click that link and you can find out how you can support our journalism. Today, we are going to be taking questions about the legislative session in Alabama, and I am joined by a panel of our 4 columnists. And those columnists are, and I will start up top here with me, Cameron Smith and Dana McCain. I'm also joined by columnist Kyle Whitmire and Roy S. Johnson. Everybody, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for taking these questions. And since this event is made possible by our AL.com subscribers, we are going to take those questions first that our AL.com subscribers submitted in advance. So we're going to start out with those questions. As we get through those, we have some other ones, but if you are a viewer and you have a question, please drop it in the comments here, and I will get to those as possible. We're going to start out with a question first. This is for you, Roy, and this is from Sue McKinnish. Sue asks, how possible do you think that Medicaid expansion in Alabama this year, how possible do you think that is?
Gosh, Sue, I hope it's extremely possible. And certainly if it's not possible now, it'll never be. I mean, this is an embarrassment for this state. As many people know, Alabama is one of only 12 states in the United States that does not have expanded Medicare for the working poor in the state who, according to the law, only qualify if they make up to about $17,000 individually and about $30,000 as a family. We have so many people in this state who are working in construction, who are working in home health care, who are working in child care, who simply cannot afford health care. And the cost for us, I know that the legislature tries not to say that, the Republican-led legislature tries not to say that political pressure, because this was created under Obama, is not a factor. It certainly is absolutely a factor in the state not expanding Medicare early on when the feds were paying 100% of it for the first 2 years and 90% thereafter. Now it's still 90%, but now the Biden administration is offering under the new coronavirus rescue plan to raise that another 5%. So 95% of the costs, at least for the first 2 years, will be paid for. And the cost for me is really beyond dollars and cents. There's some people in Montgomery who are sitting with their adding machines, because I know they don't have calculators, with their adding machines and pencils and paper trying to figure out the ultimate cost. But to me, the costs here are in saving Alabamians' lives. The costs we've seen now through the coronavirus, the amazing disparities that we have here in healthcare. Just 2 years ago, we were ranked 45th in the country in healthcare by U.S. News and World Report. And to hear we're not 48th or 49th, people are having a party. But 45th still stinks. We should not be happy about that at all. We know that the disparities racially here are tremendous. Black babies in this state are dying, infant mortality rate at twice the rate of white babies. We should all be embarrassed by that. So we should take this opportunity to provide medical services and access to quality health care to people who deserve it, to our working poor. Because if we don't do it now, it's going to continue to cost us much more in the future, with lost lives, with people with just more cases of instances and illnesses that affect their lives and their families' lives. I just think if we don't do this now, we may never do it, and that's an embarrassment.
I want to add something to that, Ivana. One thing that I keep seeing, and it's becoming a theme right now, is that some of our Republican officials, our governor, our lawmakers, are actually kind of drifting away from their base, or their base is drifting away from them on some key issues. And this is one of them. Medicaid expansion polls well here, even among Republicans. And, I think they became anchored in one place, and they think that their base is a permanent thing. But I think most folks realize now that, this battle is over with. Like Obamacare, if Obamacare was not the Affordable Care Act, whichever you want to call it, was not done away with in the last 4 years, it's not going anywhere. And so we might as well be taking advantage of this program instead of letting Alabama taxpayers' dollars that are going to the federal government fund healthcare in other states.
Cameron, I know you wanted to add something to that as well.
Yeah, I just don't think it's this simple. I mean, I hear what Roy is saying, what Kyle's saying, in that, hey, we want to take care of people, but the how is as important as the do we flip the money switch. And you're looking at $250 to $300 million a year that Alabama's probably on the hook for and would have to come up with to do this. But for example, Medicaid is not a throw money at it and everyone's better and all the healthcare situations go away. That's not the case. Alabama runs a regional care organization model. And so you've got a managed care system, you've got middlemen. And if you just put more money into it, the question I have is, okay, who profits from this? Is it the case that, hey, the folks that actually need the care are getting the care, are staying healthier? If you have a system in place that can do that, let's talk. I think that Kyle's right. There are people that say, hey, this program's here, taking advantage of this and having an expansion that makes sense is a good idea. But you got to look at the way that you're doing Medicaid, because if this is just a situation where you throw more money at it and the cats that are running the RCOs get richer, but the healthcare outcomes don't really change and you're still 45th, that's not good.
I get that, but those are all things. Go ahead, Roy.
Yeah, nothing is clearly simple and nothing is quick. Nothing is going to change overnight. We know where we are. We know, and we've had 10 years. We know how long it took us to get here with these health disparities. So to say that it's not simple, of course, I agree with you. It's not simple. It wasn't simple that we took access away from our rural the residents and make people drive, dozens of miles to even, access a doctor. It wasn't fair that it closed down. It wasn't simple that we closed down hospitals in many areas and we have food deserts. So none of this is going to change overnight. We know what we're doing now isn't working. So I'm willing to take that risk, to take this $900 million that the federal government is going to provide for the state over the next couple of years and see if we can make a dent in what we now know isn't working. If we can make a dent in people's lives, we're not going to know the outcome within the first year, within the first 2 years, maybe not within the first 5 years. But we do know that if we don't do anything, it's going to get worse and more and more people are going to get sicker and die.
I'm going to stop you both there and say I understand that this is how everybody feels about this. I do want somebody to maybe answer to the question. I don't know, Roy or Kyle or Cameron, from Sue and Liza about White had the same question. Is it possible, whether anybody likes it or not, what is the likelihood that that's going to happen?
I mean, we're stuck in the same place we've been stuck in every year, which is the governor says, what about that extra money? And the federal government keeps coming in and says, well, at least for the first 2 years, you don't have to worry about it. But we somehow find the extra money for prisons, right? I mean, we have a governor right now who's already signed at least 1-2 contracts for a prison lease, and we still don't really know what the heck is in that thing. So money doesn't seem to be an issue when it comes to incarcerating people, but when you're talking about making people healthy, and the thing that I think that is really undermines the sort of the Republican argument here, or the conservative argument, has been that these aren't freeloaders; these are working people who are stuck in this little gap, who cannot afford, who don't qualify for Medicaid as it exists now, but can't afford health care otherwise. And if you're not providing some opportunity there, you're either pushing them in one of two directions, and usually it's going to be down, right? I mean, usually you're going to draw back and say, well, if it's cheaper for me not to get a job, or if I get a job, then I'm going to not be able to afford the health care coverage I have now under Medicaid. That's a problem. We need that bridge.
I'll answer the.
Go ahead. I'll try to answer Sue's question. I think it's more likely now than it ever has been. We have more access to information. We have a better understanding of exactly what the federal government is providing. And as Kyle mentioned earlier, more Republicans in this state are now in favor of expanding Medicaid. So I think it's more likely now than it's ever been. Whether that is 20% or 60%, I don't know. But at least to hear that the governor is, quote, open to the discussion, I still would like to see a bona fide healthcare commission comprising the top minds. We've got great medical minds in this state. We've got great business minds in this state. Let's all bring them together and let us know how we begin to attack the health disparities in this state, including, making expanding Medicaid part of that. Bring that commission together, get this started, and let's see what we can do for the people of this state. I think that's more likely now than ever.
Well,
Yeah, I think
we're gonna have to move on to the next question for Dana here, and we will back to Medicaid if we can. Dana, a question for you from Pat DeWeese. He says, instead of just tweaking Alabama's sex education law to remove homophobic provisions, do you think that legislators will repeal the law altogether?
I really don't know. It's so difficult when we get into public school classrooms and start talking about conversations that I believe and many believe are best had within the confines of the family unit, where your family's values are, fully fleshed out and able to be employed in that conversation. We need to label the terms here, because what one person would call homophobic provisions, another person would call something else. So I think there's a little bit of a culture war element, obviously, to that whole idea. And I'm always one of those who will pull back and say, I would rather us not be having those conversations in public school classrooms. I would rather us be having those conversations in homes and in churches.
Kyle, you want to respond to that?
I think that the conversations are going to happen in school, whether they happen in the classroom or in the hallway afterwards, right? I think that we've seen, over and over again that realistic sexual education in public schools leads to better outcomes for the students in those programs. They don't have to guess about the facts of life. And we're not making value judgments here, but one thing that, has been a value judgment that needs to go away is this notion, which has been taught in schools, that homosexuality is a crime. It's not anymore. And that just needs to stop.
And I would agree with you that I do not mind or have any pushback toward the kind of sex education that takes place in the context of, say, a biology or an anatomy and physiology classroom. I think that is a perfectly acceptable context in which to talk about, the human body and reproduction and all of those things. I think when we get into the realm of sex education, that is where we get into some really muddy water. Where, various cultural agendas, whether they be of the far right or of the far left, start influencing the way that information is presented. And value judgments begin to be made, both positively and negatively, about that information. So I think Kyle and I would agree that there is an appropriate way to talk about these things and to equip children with the knowledge of, how their bodies work and how human reproduction works and those kinds of things. Beyond that, all of the different things that we today culturally pack in under the umbrella of sex education, a lot of it I do not believe belongs in an Alabama public school classroom.
Yeah, what do you think that legislators are going to do about that? Do you think that that's something that's going to stick? Is that something that's going to be in Alabama for a time to come, or are we looking at change in that area?
I'll be honest, I have not had a conversation with enough legislators on that particular bill to have a clear sense of which way that will shake out in the legislature. So I would be hesitant to make a prognostication there. I can just tell you sort of how I would handle it if I were sitting in their seat.
Given the typical rate of change in our state legislature, I don't think we'll see anything significant movement in this session on this front. I mean, for me, I think we cannot absolve our schools from being part of the discussion that is being had not just in the hallways of the schools and in the playgrounds and places like that that are on school grounds, but throughout all these kids' lives. Now they're just subjected to so many discussions, so many points of view, that to build a wall around our schools and say we shouldn't have certain discussions is really naive, and taking responsibility away from schools. I think part of the responsibility of schools is to provide accurate, fair, and information, and particularly in the sense of how we treat each other as human beings. So for me, the discussion centers around fairness, equity, and respect. If we teach those things in our schools, no matter what the subject matter is, I think that is important for schools to do that, because we can't say that the discussions are always happening in the home, but they're happening on social media, they're happening on these kids' phones and on their various platforms, and they're happening in the hallways. And so I think it's the responsibility of the schools to position young people to treat others fairly, to treat them equitably, and to treat them with respect. And whether that's sex education, bullying, all of these things fall into that category. So I don't think we should build a wall around our schools and say, oh no, let's not talk about that, because the schools absolutely have to be part of the discussion.
But from a moral
get
standpoint, so from a moral standpoint or from an informational standpoint, that's what I'm curious, because I think there's a distinction there to say, hey, this is objectively a reality in the world and doing that biological thing. But the idea that, the school is an authoritative, voice on here's the moral aspect of this, and this. I mean, do you think that that's just sort of, all fair game? Or do you think it should be, hey, I'm trying to convey information that's accurate and fair to you?
The moral issue is there already. I mean, you already have absence-only education in a lot of schools. You have curriculum that teaches kids that homosexuality is a crime when it's not. I think from my take is, we should remove the moral questions and leave those to homes and churches, and provide students with as much objective fact as they can, and frankly let their curiosity lead the conversations. I know it's kind of weird, but a well-practiced teacher in that setting can navigate that.
We're going to get more to the gender and sex question here in a little bit. We've got several of those. I promise we'll get there. I do have a question though for you, Cameron, also from Pat DeWeese. And he says, how does Alabama justify the continued use of the death penalty when states without the death penalty, such as Wisconsin, have lower violent crime rates?
I think Alabama's approach has basically been, this is an option for punishment going into committing a crime. And when you make that choice, there is a penalty that is quite severe. I think what we're seeing now in a lot of these death penalty cases is a situation where, oh man, that wasn't 100% accurate. We might have messed up there. And I think that's something that, as long as the death penalty is on the table as a punishment, you almost need a higher standard of proof, evidentiary proof, to make sure that we don't execute somebody that didn't do the crime. And I think that's perpetually going to be an issue. I think that's a conversation worth having. But in terms of, hey, this is an option on the table. If you commit this certain set of crimes, this is an available penalty to the state. I think for most legislators in Alabama, that's sort of the calculus, that this isn't a surprise on the back end when you find that you've committed a capital crime. And I think the real issue is that person not just guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, but are we certain that that person committed that crime? I think that's a fair question for debate.
Kyle?
We aren't even close to having that standard in our court system. We have a man on death row right now, DeForest Johnson, who the prosecutors could not decide whether he or another man had committed the crime. So they decided, to heck with it, we'll just throw them both in front of a jury, two separate juries, and see which one sticks. So in one courtroom, they went before a jury and said, this man committed the crime. And then after they had a mistrial in that case, they went in another courtroom and said, this guy over here committed the crime. And then when they had a mistrial in this one, they went over here and tried this guy again. And they used the witness that pointed the finger at this man, when the other defendant used that same witness as a defense witness, the same prosecutor said, you can't believe a word this woman says, even though in another case they had said that she was a credible witness. I mean, these are things that happened just 15 years ago in this state, and frankly still continue to happen until after the fact. These cases get the attention they deserve when we know someone is on death row. We are nowhere close to having a criminal justice system that can ensure beyond proof, beyond reasonable doubt, when you have prosecutors who are just kind of throwing their wild guesses up against the wall and seeing which one sticks.
Dan, I know you want to respond to that.
Yeah, there's sort of two planes on which I think about this issue. The first is obviously the moral plane. And for myself as a Orthodox Christian, I am pro-life from womb to tomb. I think that, we're all created in the image of God and that life is sacred. And so I find it really difficult, even in the pursuit of justice and fairness, to take the life of an individual. And I find it even more indefensible when we do have a criminal justice system that is as flawed as we know ours is. It's a lot better than what exists in many parts of the world, but that does not make it perfect. And when we're talking about sacrificing the life of an individual, it dang sure better be perfect. And we're just not there. So, and I have noticed even in conservative evangelical circles, there is a somewhat changing narrative on this. You see more millennial evangelicals who are, as I describe myself, more womb to tomb conservatives who are increasingly uncomfortable with the death penalty as an idea. And you see different states, I think it was just yesterday, they abolished the death penalty in Virginia, which was the first Southern state to fall on that issue. So the conversation is shifting around this issue, and I find it interesting.
Well, that's good to hear, Dana, and I'll weigh in pretty much in a similar lane as a Christian living in a state where faith is almost as grounded as football. How we can, and we've tossed this word around, morally justify killing another human being when one of the main commandments is thou shalt not kill. Certainly as humans, we have emotions, and when we see some crimes that are committed, we in our own feelings feel that this person deserves to die. Well, that is not our call. We are called to a higher standard, and so I don't see how we continue to justify that and also go to church every Sunday and claim to believe in all of the things that we are led to believe. Certainly not everyone does that, but in this state, faith is a solid foundation of almost everything we do, except when it comes to our criminal justice system and certainly the death penalty. So I'll agree with you, Dana, that it's hard to justify, in particular, the way it's done. I mean, I know Ivana has witnessed some of these things, and they have to be some of the most heinous moments to sit there and watch the us as human beings and us as the people of the state of Alabama put something to death, know that it's not a perfect system, know that there still may be a scintilla of a chance that person didn't do it. It's just a horrible thing, and it's certainly something that's going to be around for a while, but it's a contradiction based on what we as Southerners and what we as Christians believe, that we should not be killing another human being.
I'll follow up for you, Dana, on that, and then I'll get to you, Cam. I know you wanted to throw in. It was your question. I'll give you the last word on it. But quickly, Dana, I have a question here in the comments from someone that says, and I think it relates to the point you were making. This person says, how can people who say they are pro-life and many Christian people, many conservative people saying that justify the death penalty? I know that you do not, but I was asking more in the sense of how you believe some of your colleagues do.
I think it is. I think it's an important question to ask, and in a debate that I've heard in evangelical Christian circles in a lot of different contexts in recent years. There's a theological argument to be had about just killing. We go to war, and identify some of that loss of life as a pursuit of justice and freedom, and we are okay with that. And so, there's a way to construct an argument on biblical grounds, and many do, for just wars and just killing. I just feel like because of the reasons we've already sort of explored here today, the flaws in the criminal justice system. And listen, if you're a person for whom this has no moral resonance whatsoever, and you're just a bottom line conservative, you need to understand that the death penalty is so exorbitantly expensive and ineffective. We don't have any data to prove that it actually lowers the rates of violent crime. We spend scads of money keeping people on death row and going through decades of appellate processes, and then, you know, take that life. And I'm not sure we're one scintilla better off as a state. We have spent a lot of money to get to that point. So, but I agree that there's an important conversation to be had about what it means to be truly pro-life. What is that grounded in biblically and morally, and how do we apply it to more issues than just abortion?
Cameron, last word on this.
Yeah, and I'll answer that question directly. I don't think the justification is difficult. It's, we tell you for this range of offenses, this penalty is there. If you choose to go out and go in a gas station on video, shoot 3 or 4 people in the head, well, guess what? You've made a choice, and the penalty for that choice was laid before you made that call. So in terms of it being something that requires personal responsibility to not commit capital crimes, I don't have a functional problem with that. What I think the state should do, and if there's any movement on it, this is likely going to be the solution, is break the trial into 2 phases. It's already there. It's a conviction for a capital crime, and then a sentencing phase with a heightened standard that says, if we do not have, call it whatever you want, but absolute certainty that this individual committed this act, then it's life in prison or something like that. If there's that heightened standard, then that death penalty is still there. I think that if you don't have absolute certainty that someone committed the crime, we've just seen too much room for error, and I think that's a huge problem.
We're going to move on. Kyle, this is a question from Joanne Jordan. She says, what is being done about pollution in Alabama's waterways?
Nothing.
Next question, right?
What can be done? What can legislators that are sitting in the Capitol, what can they do about this pollution? And I know that Joanne asked about waterways, but just in general, we know that has been a problem. We have seen countless stories, photos, et cetera, things that we don't even know what it is. Maybe some people call it sludge in different parts of the state. What can legislators even do about that?
Well, the first thing we need is a functioning state agency that polices environmental problems, because what we've seen is Alabama has sort of taken a step back in environmental enforcement and let the EPA handle all that stuff. And you get one administration that cares a lot about the environment, and you get one standard, as we saw in North Birmingham. And then suddenly you have a new administration and all that goes away. We need something consistent, and we need a state that will, at the very least, look, ADEM knew that 3M had dumped toxins in the Tennessee River system, right, upstream from where people took their drinking water. They didn't tell them. They didn't even just say, hey, y'all might like to know this, but this company just admitted, like they self-reported dumping toxins right upstream from where you take your water. Instead, what we've seen out of the legislature, and it thankfully none of these things have come to fruition yet, is like the bill we saw last year where they were going to pass a bill to make it illegal to use drones for environmental groups to use drones to police water pollution. I mean, there are polluters that we know about only because these watchdog groups, put a drone up in the air and flew over. The case I wrote about last year was the McCain mine on the Locust Fork system. There's just like a dead area off the side of the riverbank where all this filth had been coming out of this mine and going into the water, just a couple miles upstream from where Bessemer gets its drinking water. So as far as what does the legislature need to do, it's really more the governor and others who make these appointments to the Alabama Environmental Management Commission that need to appoint people who are not aiding and abetting polluters. When I say aiding and abetting, literally one of those former commissioners is under indictment right now for ethics crimes for having worked with the same polluters that he was supposed to be policing on this commission. It just we need ADEM to do its job. That's as simple as it
And
gets.
Kyle, I just don't get a sense that there is a strong appetite in this state, particularly among lawmakers, to do better when it comes to our environment. I don't get the sense of that. You don't get it from the funding that is provided, as you mentioned. You don't get it in terms of the appointments that are made, and when there are egregious, clear cases, they tend to fade away with the next weather front. And left behind are typically poor people, who don't have a voice, who don't have the authority and the strength to get their attention. And I just don't sense that there's a strong appetite in this state among leaders and even among citizens to do better when it comes to our environment. And that's unfortunate.
And I want to add one thing to that. When I covered the corruption trial of David Robertson and Joel Gilbert, who were accused of bribing State Representative Oliver Robinson, I sat through what we call voir dire, the jury selection process, and which is kind of like speed dating with 150 people at a time. And it was a really eye-opening experience for me, because I think we've been sort of conditioned to think of environmental issues as conservative liberal, right? Conservatives are pro-business and liberals are pro-environment. And what was remarkable to me was how many self-identified conservatives, Republicans in that jury pool held up their hands and said they approved of the job that the EPA does, and they approved of its mission, and they did not like pollution in their waters and in the air. This is, I think, going back to my theme for the day, this is an issue where elected officials, and especially Republican elected officials and their Republican constituents, have begun to drift apart, and they need to go back to those constituents and talk to them and find out what really matters to them. So I think they would, having clean air, having clean water, being able to take your grandkid fishing and eat the fish that you catch, that's important to them.
Cameron, I know you wanted to respond to that, and then we're going to move on.
Yeah, I think the big issue here is that at some point, and the polling shows that on issues of the environment, Democrats are just more trusted than Republicans on a lot of this stuff. And that's a shame, because there are tons of hook and barrel conservatives in states like Alabama, throughout the South, who care deeply about the environment. But this became a liberal issue, right? This became Green New Deal, all of this stuff. Anytime we talk about the environment, that's really, really bad. Because if that's the case, and then it's like, well, I want to do an environmental thing, I want to incentivize businesses to clean up after themselves and do this, but maybe people will think I'm now a liberal. That scares a lot of legislators from doing this stuff. But I for one, I care about a lot of environmental issues. I think this is a massive error for Republicans to kind of surrender the ground, because the New Deal fantasy land environmental policies of the left ought to be opposed, but not with nothing. With, hey, this is a cooperative program where we're policing ourselves, where we want to do this, because the issue is not either you do things good for the environment or not, it's how. And I think that's where we have to be on the same page.
Well, and along those lines, I would add, as an electoral strategy for Republicans going forward, I think there needs to be a recognition that this is an issue that is important to young conservatives. Millennial conservatives, Gen Z conservatives, they view this differently than their parents and grandparents do. And so I think it's something that we're going to have to pay attention to.
Question now about money. This is from Will Johnston. This question is saying, quote, here Alabama takes more from the federal government, meaning money, than we send in. Is that true? And how much is this is used for things like defense spending, military bases, space, etc.? That is open to whoever believes that they are equipped to answer that one.
Whew. I've tried to answer that question several times, and it really does get down to like, what do you lump into money coming into Alabama? Generally, we get somewhere between $20 and $30 billion a year from the federal government. And that number gets substantially bigger when you include things like investment in Redstone Arsenal, or, highway projects, money for, dredging Mobile Bay, that type of stuff. But it is significantly more than what we contribute in taxes into the federal system.
Kim?
Yeah, Alabama is what we call a donee state. It's basically 2 to 1, that for every tax dollar that goes to Washington, Alabama gets 2 back. And I mean, it varies a little bit, but it is significant. What's funny is people in Alabama and in other states that are donee states think, well, I'm getting a good deal. But the truth is, most states are becoming donee states because we are just spending like we're drunk at the federal level. And so it's not dependent. There's no connection really to tax dollars going anywhere. It's, we've got some revenue, but that seems really restrictive. So let's just kind of spray it around. And that's what we're seeing with a lot of the coronavirus stuff, things like that. And really what's happened here is it sort of historically, you had more of the Democrats saying, no, we want to spend on programs to do stuff. And Republicans, at least in theory, were saying, actually, let's not do that. Republicans over the Trump administration and even now are like, let's join the party. And there's not a whole lot of fiscal responsibility at all. So the idea that there's some correlation there is silly.
Hopefully there will be a little bit more accountability, particularly with the $4 billion that will be coming down the pike from the latest coronavirus package. At least perhaps we'll be able to track that and do the best we can, certainly in our position as columnists and as journalists and those others who are on our AL.com team, to ensure that that money is being spent in ways that do benefit Alabamians and not just the people whose pockets that those dollars go into. So we have a unique opportunity and responsibility as journalists to turn that light up. It's only $4 billion, and as we've heard, we get a lot more than that every year. But let's commit to continuing to shine the light on where this money is going, and ensure that it's not just going to prisons, that it's not just going into someone's pocket to make them rich, that it's actually going to benefit the lives of Alabamians and give them the tools to improve their own lives, and not just make it a short-term solution, but something that has a long-term benefit.
That's a good point, Roy. And we have one more subscriber question I want to get to, and I want to get through it so we can take some of the questions that we've gotten here from people watching today. I know we're more than halfway through the program, so I'm going to put this one out, and I'm not sure as much as this is a question, but I think this is a subscriber submitted statement that I think you all will enjoy. This is from Penny. And Penny calls legislators seat warmers. And she asks why they will not pass bills that constituents want to vote on. She specifically says, quote, we want the lottery and to ship wine to our homes. And Penny did give us permission to use her name in this. And she also added, you, not meaning you, meaning legislators, what you think is right, but you are there to serve us. So I will give each of you a chance to make a comment on Penny's statement, and then we're going to get to some of these other questions.
She's right. We do want to have wine shipped to our homes, but the bottom line for this is they don't trust the voters. They think they know better. There are parents without having a conversation with us about what is best for us, and that has been the mindset for so long that it's hard to flip that switch. I mean, she's absolutely right. At least put some of these things to a vote. I mean, there's so many issues. You can even start with our just horrendous Constitution that need to be addressed, and I think most Alabamians would agree that some of those things need to be changed. But the fact is, lawmakers just don't trust the voters, and like, oh my gosh, they may actually make a decision where they think voters aren't as informed as they are. But based on some of the conversations I've had, some of the things I've read, I'm not going to say I trust lawmakers to be as informed as I think they should be either.
Kyle, did you have anything to add there?
I would say on the gambling issue, the complexity of gambling law in Alabama is such that every year when it comes back up, it's like I crammed for an exam last year and now I have to go back and take the same test again. And I can't remember anything that I learned last semester, right? The reason we don't have a lottery in Alabama is not because we have a bunch of religious prudes who are totally against it. That's part of it. But it is also because you have in-state casino interests who are not Indian gaming casinos. You have the Indian casinos, and then you have folks, like me, who are just not really hot on the idea of having wide open legalized gambling. Gambling, not gaming. That's the gambling industry's term. They want you to call it gaming. But I think what most people want is not what the legislature is trying to deal with. They just want to be able to go buy a Powerball ticket whenever the Powerball gets above $500 million, right?
And not have to drive to Georgia to do it.
Right. They that's really all they want.
They're
talking about education and all this other stuff. They just wanted a convenient way to go buy a Powerball ticket. And unfortunately, what happens when we get into the legislature is it gets deep into all these other issues, because if you open up certain classes of gaming, then one casino or another might have an advantage over its competitors. And they all have their politicians that they are connected to, and they have sort of this 3 or 4 way fight. As far as, it's going to be very hard to get gambling legislation through, no matter how you do it. I think we came very close this year. I don't think it's going to happen this year, but it's kind of like a Rubik's Cube. You solve one side and you screw up all the others. And one day somebody is going to solve the Rubik's Cube. As far as wine by mail, I ABC board may hate it, but I don't think anybody has an issue with that. They should go ahead and get that done. That should be an easy fix. I'm
looking through these questions over here. If you see my eyes darting to the side, and there's a lot of people who want to talk about the lottery. I know we just briefly touched on it, but there's another topic that people want to talk about, and that is some of the transgender legislation that is in the legislature right now. Now, we need to note that there are different pieces of legislation, but and this is open to whoever would like to address it first. Is there an important difference between the pieces of legislation? One, legislation to organize sports by biological sex, and one to prevent medical interventions into transgender youth.
Yes, I think there is a distinction between those two pieces of legislation in that who is impacted either positively or negatively by them. In the case of the Vulnerable Child Compassion and Protection Act, which places limitations on the kinds of treatments that can be prescribed and carried out with minors who are identifying as transgender, that piece of legislation is designed and has the intent of protecting vulnerable children, who are trying to wrestle with a condition that is still very much new, even in the medical conversation. I had a conversation with a well-respected pediatrician about a year ago when I was writing a piece of commentary on this issue. And he's not some backwater pediatrician. He's a past president of the Alabama chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. And he said, Dana, I see these children in my practice and my heart breaks for them and for their families. He said, but the bottom line is that the science and the research that we need to know what good medicine is here is not in place yet. But the cultural narrative and the cultural and political pressure that is being exerted upon the medical community and is, even existing within the medical community to get on the right side of the culture on this is causing us to let the medicine get ahead of the science. And to his way of thinking, that was more or less a violation of his Hippocratic oath to first do no harm. He said, I do not want to be out there practicing a style of medicine with a vulnerable child without great assurance that the methods and the treatments that we would use would first do no harm to that child and hopefully provide some help to that child. So
Roy, do you think that the Alabama was right to pass the Vulnerable Child Compassion and Protection Act?
I was listening to Dana, and I have an issue with the word protection. And my first thought is protect from whom? I don't trust our lawmakers to set up that protection when those discussions, as you mentioned earlier, should be between parents and their children. There should be that opportunity for them to do research, to speak with their own medical provider. You spoke with one who has his own issues and certainly his own trepidation, but there are others who might feel differently and who certainly would not violate their Hippocratic oath, however they measure it, but should be able to have a conversation with parents, with these youth. I know we portray them as vulnerable, but all kids are vulnerable. They're vulnerable to social media. They're vulnerable in many ways that are beyond our control. So to all of a sudden just place them in an extra vulnerable category because they are having conversations with themselves and their families about gender identity. These are tough conversations, but they're conversations that are being had in the open now. They're conversations that they're feeling easier and better about coming to their parents with, as opposed to just speaking among themselves. And I think that's a good thing, no matter what you believe about the issue. I think it's important that we make it easier and safer for young people to have conversations with their parents about very difficult and challenging issues and things that they're confronting. So I'm a little leery of the lawmakers passing this and standing up and saying they're protecting people. We have a long way to go, and I think that we should allow these conversations, the research, to continue to grow, and to allow families to have conversations with their medical professionals and make the decisions that are best for them.
Dana and then Karen.
Yeah, and this bill in no way inhibits conversations. Medical providers and mental health counselors are still able to have those conversations with children who are wrestling with gender dysphoria and still able to have those conversations with their parents. What the bill prohibits are treatments which may have long-lasting effects, because one of the things we do know about gender dysphoria is that many children and adolescents who present with it often have those symptoms resolve later on. And there's a whole subculture out there, sadly, that is growing of people who have wrestled with that issue in their personal lives and who transitioned and now are trying to detransition. And that's heartbreaking, because many of those people have subjected themselves to treatments that they can't undo. And so I think the heart of the bill is correct, and I think the pragmatics of the bill are correct, in that those children can still receive counseling and other treatments that do not have long-lasting effects, but those things that they would not be able to take back later should their gender dysphoria resolve and they decide they do not need to or want to transition, they would not have damaged themselves or injured themselves in any way. It's just saying, let's tap the brakes. There's so much we still don't know about this condition and how best to treat it.
Cameron, and I'll let you address that, and also the legislation about the sports teams.
Yeah, so I think the immutability, the irreversibility is an issue that I think is worth dealing with, simply because to have minors that are passionately one way to say this is who I am, who might change their mind. It's one thing for them to be that way. It's another thing to take steps that they can't reverse, and we know their brains aren't fully developed. That's a big deal. I do think that legislation is importantly different than the sports legislation. And what I mean by that is there are biological realities and norms that apply in this case. And I understand we need to be accommodating. We should show some empathy. This shouldn't be just anger. But even the NCAA, and looking at, well, if you transition female to male, you can play immediately. If you transition male to female, you have to be on hormone therapies for X amount of time. I mean, there are sports bodies that are recognizing the realities of the biology in this situation. And while we should try to be accommodating, there's also another subset of particularly women's sports saying, well, what about the folks that want a level playing field, and there's biological differences here that matter? And I think that those sports laws that are trying to address that, and it may be a little clumsy, but trying to figure that out in a way that's fair, that particularly, we're talking about women's sports here. We're not really talking about men's sports. I mean, transitioning female to male sports, there's not a fairness issue there that people are talking about. This is particularly with respect to women's sports. And I think it's something that is categorically different than, say, the medical care and medical treatment for individuals and their families. This is how do we interact together in a way that's encouraging, but also fair.
Kyle, you haven't gotten to say anything on this one.
I just real quick, my default here is anytime the legislature is trying to practice medicine without a license, that's a bad idea. But you know, if the issue really is that the science hasn't caught up with what the medical community is trying to do, then let's put a sunset on this legislation. Let's say we're going to come back to it, and you know that this is effective for 5 years, 10 years, and revisit it. Because the trouble is, just like we've sort of seen with our monuments law, is that once something is in place and everybody realizes maybe we screwed up there, it's that much harder to undo that bad legislation.
I know we just have a few more minutes here, so I want to give everybody a chance to follow up on maybe anything that they didn't get to make their point on earlier. You each have a couple of minutes. Cameron, I will start with you, and Dana, and then we'll go to Colin Roy.
So I think one of the issues that there were two in the Medicaid, the biggest issue, if you want to see action on a Medicaid expansion, is you've got to have a Republican champion that's willing to do the work to build out, hey, this is the way it can make sense. You know, Florida's done some Medicaid pilots that, you know, were spearheaded by Jeb Bush that actually were really successful and creative. And so there is a pathway there, but as long as this is just the binary of expand or not expand, there's going to be no traction, because for many Republicans, Roy's right, this started out with Affordable Care Act. This is seen as consenting to Affordable Care Act. They don't like that. So Alabama's going to have to find a champion there. I also think that, you know, particularly in the family space, one of the things that I don't know why it hasn't come up sooner, but dealing with minor access to things like pornography is something that it's a little interesting in a red state like Alabama, that folks haven't sort of brought up some of these topics and say, hey, what are we doing to, if we're talking about the transgender issues and things like that, what about the issues of the psychological impact of minors being exposed to some of this content online? Is there anything that the state can do there? Because that's a public health issue too. And I think it would be interesting to see the state, you know, look at some of those spaces as well.
Dana.
I just wanted to add on the topic of the transgender athlete bill. You know, I think a lot of people assume that hormone suppressors are able to completely level the biological playing field between athletes born biologically male and born biologically female. And I think that's just inaccurate, because there are a host of biological differences that are not touched by a reduction in testosterone, bone density, muscle mass. You know, there are just a whole host of things that that still remain biological differences between the two genders. And when you put those two athletes out there side to side, despite best efforts, I think it would still leave female athletes at a distinct disadvantage. I agree with the perspective that we need to find compassionate, empathetic ways to navigate these issues, but I don't think that destroying women's sports is necessary or fair or right as a way to try to accommodate people who are transgender.
Kyle.
I've talked too much already, so
Roy.
I think I got everything out that I wanted to say.
I'll say I went ahead and skipped you when you said that, Roy.
I'll touch on two things. One, I think we cannot ignore the voter suppression efforts that are happening across the country, and including here in Alabama. I mean, we've just come from an election that, yes, it was very divisive, but to see as many people vote as voted, to exercise their constitutional right to vote, and to do it in a way that was fair and equitable and was clean. There was no fraud. There was never proven any fraud or any discernible fraud. We should all celebrate that as Americans. That is the right that was given to each and every citizen who qualifies under the Constitution. And these efforts to curtail that, to restrict voting, should be fought on every level and by everyone, because everyone should have the right to vote fair and equitably. And we will continue, and should all of us here should continue to shine a light on any efforts to restrict voting in this state by anyone. And the last thing I will say is, I think we are at a very unique point in our nation's history and in our state's history. We've all come from a year where we battled the effects of a virus that we haven't seen in 100 years, the types of effects that we haven't seen in a century. You know, people have died, people have suffered, both physically and economically. And we all had to sit down and really make some decisions about what's important to us and what's important for us to do for our neighbors. We also came on a year of tremendous racial reckoning based on not just social injustice, but the things that we saw with our eyes, and things that all of us thought were heinous and that justice should be meted out in ways that show that we're not going to tolerate some of the things that we're seeing. So we have an opportunity to take advantage of this last year and come together on some issues and have conversations like this. We may not agree on how everything should be done, but let's look at areas like health disparities. I don't think anyone would disagree that we should do everything we can to try to ensure that everyone has a fair access to quality health care and the types of things like healthy foods, sidewalks, that helps them lead the kind of lifestyle that won't put them in a vulnerable position. All of our kids deserve a great education. It shouldn't be dependent on the poverty level of their neighborhood. When you have districts with 100% of the students qualify for free lunch, we should do something to try to make sure that kids can all read at the third grade level, because we know that those kids who cannot read by the third grade level have a higher chance of spending their next years in the criminal justice system, as opposed to going to college or becoming someone who is a capable and productive person in the workforce. So we should all want all of our kids to be better educated and put resources into that. And we should look at our criminal justice system on all levels so that our trials are fair, so that our prosecutors are not biased, so that our bail system isn't unfair to the poor, and that people are not sitting in jails for nonviolent crimes simply because they cannot afford bail, which causes them to lose their job, which causes them to not be able to feed their family. So there are areas in our world and in our lives that we've kind of ignored for the last 10 years, that we've all lived in our own bubbles, and all of a sudden we were put in this massive bubble of coronavirus and social justice, and we're starting to come out of it. What do we do with what we learned? What do we do with what we saw? And we have a real opportunity and an obligation to take what we saw, take what we learned, and try to make lives better for those around us, our families, our neighbors, and for anyone across the state.
Well, Cameron Smith, Kyle Whitmire, Dana McCain, Roy Johnson, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for tackling these hard questions and having an open dialogue about it. If you would like to find more from these four columnists, you can find all of that on AL.com. If you would like to be part of our next event such as this and have that opportunity to submit questions, you can support our journalism by going to AL.com/subscribe. Again, thank you all for your conversations. Everybody, thank you so much for watching. Everybody stay safe during the weather today, and we appreciate you.